Hello everyone, good morning and a very warm welcome to today's webinar on the latest improvements in Sage Payroll version 27.1 in relation to enhanced reporting requirements. My name's Duncan, I'll be hosting the session today. Let's now take a look at what we'll cover in the webinar. So we're going to start with an introduction to serve as a reminder of the enhanced reporting requirements legislation and the process to submit ERR in Sage Payroll. And then we're going to focus on what's changed in the latest update to Sage Payroll, version 27.1, which was released just yesterday and is currently available for you to download from our help center. So we'll start with some processing improvements, and many of these have been requested by yourselves in your feedback from webinars and other similar events. So we're going to show you an enhancement to the payments where you can assign an ERR subcategory to your expense payments, which is going to streamline the categorization process later on down the line. And also the ability to process rate-based payments where there's a set rate, for example, for remote working daily allowance. We're then going to run through some improvements that we've made to the submission process. So mainly some of the changes we've made to categorization, and also a new option to allow you to export a report before you send the enhanced reporting submission to revenue. And then we're going to look at the improvements to corrections. So it will now be possible to submit corrections for historical periods without having to restore or go back to a period archive and reprocess your payroll. And we're also going to show you a slight enhancement to the import process for those of you currently importing categorized ERR information. So all of that will take maybe 30 to 40 minutes, and we will stick around at the end to make sure we've provided answers to your questions. So keep those coming by clicking the question mark icon on the right-hand side and send your questions through to our team. So as a reminder, really, just to introduce the ERR legislation, it came into effect from the 1st of January this year, and it requires you as an employer to submit details of certain tax-free expenses and benefits that you've paid to employees or directors directly to revenue on or before the date of payment. So it's real-time reporting for these tax-free expenses and benefits. Now, currently, this only applies to expenses that are incurred by employees and then reimbursed by their employer. So if an employee has paid for one of the reportable expenses, or they've received a small benefit exemption item, and then you've paid them back, you do need to report that information to revenue. So it wouldn't include company credit cards, where you're not paying anything back to your employee, or payments that you make directly to suppliers on behalf of your employee. And you can read more about what you need to report and how this works on the revenue website. So what are the categories you need to report? Well, there are three main categories. The first one is travel and subsistence. So for any travel or subsistence expense that you're reimbursing, you need to report the date and amount of that expense. And you also need to report which of the following subcategories that expense falls into. So the 7 subcategories are travel vouched and travel unvouched, subsistence vouched and subsistence unvouched, site-based employees, and that's the category that includes country money, emergency travel, and eating on site. So for travel and subsistence, the difference between vouched and unvouched is that a vouched expense is where you're reimbursing the exact amount incurred by the employee on the basis of a receipt that they've provided, whereas an unvouched expense is where you're repaying a flat rate, and usually it's civil service rates that are allowable tax-free and as published in the revenues guidance. So if it's a rate, it's unvouched. If it's the exact amount from a receipt, it's a vouched expense. The other categories you need to report are small benefit exemption items. So when you provide a small benefit, tax-free, you need to report the amount of that benefit and the date it was provided. And you can do this a maximum of 2 times per tax year for small benefits that do not exceed €1,000 in total. And then remote working daily allowance. And for this one, you need to report the number of days, the amount paid, and the date of the payment. And you can pay up to €3.20 per day tax-free under those arrangements. So to read more guidance on this, as I say, we've got the link to the Revenue Hub available there on the handout. Now, a quick note about how Revenue are measuring compliance with this. So they are taking a service for a compliance approach from now until the 30th of June 2024, which means during this period, they won't seek to apply any penalties for non-compliance with the enhanced reporting requirements during this time. But they have since confirmed that employers must still submit all ERR reportable items that have been paid since the 1st of January 2024. So it doesn't mean it's optional up until the end of June. It just means that if you do it before the end of June, you won't get any penalties for non-compliance. If you decide that you're not going to start doing this until after then, you won't be within this service for compliance window. So it's best to get started with this as soon as you can. And it is all reportable items paid since the 1st of January. So that's just a little bit around the legislation. I just want to recap the process for those of you that are using Sage Payroll to submit ERR. And obviously that's what we're going to focus on in the webinar today. So the current process is that you would enter expense payments in the time and pay screen. So you would configure payments as expenses, and that will flag an employee to be included in the submission. You run end of period, so you need to have finalized your payroll. And then you do a submission, which involves categorizing the expenses into the categories required by Revenue, and then sending that information directly from your payroll software. And when it sends a submission, the date of the expenses payments is reported as the same as your payroll pay date. So whichever period you've processed the expense in, that is the pay date reported as the expenses payment date. Now, as you'll see in the webinar today, we've made some improvements to this process to help streamline it based on your feedback. So much of what I'm going to show you today is as a direct result of feedback from our customers. So for example, we're going to show you a way of streamlining the categorization by assigning an ERR category to your expense payments. We're going to look at improved corrections, enabling you to resubmit previous periods without necessarily restoring back. And we'll also see some of the rate-based payments that I mentioned earlier on as well. Now, to benefit from these improvements, you will need to download and install the latest update to Sage Payroll. This was released yesterday. So it's version 27.1, and it's available to download from our Help Center. So you won't find it in the automatic updates currently. At the moment, it is just available as a download from our Help Center. But if you follow the link on the slide here, that will take you to our download guide. And from there, you'll be able to grab the installer file. So just to show you where you can find that. So if you follow the link on that slide, it will take you to this article with some advice on preparing to install and some information that you'll need to check. You've got then the link to download the update. So that will download directly to your PC, and then some steps to install it. So if you're installing on a single PC, if you just use Sage Payroll from one machine, you would do a this computer install. If you're installing across a network, you will need to do a server install first. And once you've done that, when you access the program from the client machines, you'll be prompted to update the client installation. So exactly the same as what you did at year end when you installed the year end update. And then you'll also find a link to a summary of what's new at the bottom of this article. So again, you can read more on the features that we'll be showing you today in the webinar. So let's get on and take a look at some of these improvements in a bit more detail. And we're going to start with some processing improvements. And we're going to look at two things. We're going to look at payment categories and also rate-based payments. So starting with the categories, previously you would set up an expenses payment type, and then you would do all of your categorization when you came to submit the expense. But we've listened to your feedback, and we have now made it possible to assign a subcategory to an expense payment. And where you do that, it will automatically categorize those values in the submission without you having to do that manually each time. Now, we also have a setting for general enhanced reporting, categorized later, and that will be the default setting for any existing expenses payments, where you can continue to categorize manually at the point of submission. But if you want to try and streamline that, if you've got a lot of expenses that always fall under the same category, you can now set up a specific payment for that. So let's take a look at where you amend these settings. So I'm logged into Sage Payroll version 27.1, as you can see from the version number here at the top of the screen. And to get to the payment settings, I'm going to go to company/payroll and then click here onto payments. Now, currently I have 3 payments for expenses. I've got one that I use for general travel and subsistence. I've got one that I use for remote working daily allowance and another one for small benefit exemption items. And if I have a look at the settings, if I edit the first payment, you'll see that the type is set to expenses, which flags it as an ERR expense. And it now has an enhanced reporting category, and it is assigned the default category of general, which means we would categorize this expense later. Now, I'm going to keep this setting for my travel and subsistence payment because it could fall under various categories. So anything that I enter using this payment, I want to manually categorize. But looking at some of my other ones, I've got one for remote work. And if I click edit, you'll see just like before, it's been set to general. But for this one, I'm going to choose the remote working category. So any values processed with this specific payment will be categorized as remote working. Also going to do something similar for my small benefit payment. So this one, I'm going to assign to the small benefit category. And you'll see later on when we do a submission that that's going to save us a bit of time when it comes to categorizing. So that's where you would go in to amend the payment category. As I say, if you don't want to do this, just leave it as general and you can continue categorizing at the point of submission. Now, the other enhancement to the payment settings is that in version 27.1, it is now possible for you to process rate-based expenses. So rather than having to enter the total amount each time, you can link a payment to an hourly rate. And that might be suitable for payments such as remote working daily allowance, where you would enter the daily rate as the rate, or mileage payments, where you're paying a particular amount per kilometre travelled. Now, when you set up the payment, you'll need to choose which rate that is linked to. So rates 1 to 4 can be set up in the employee records, or if there's no rate set up there, you can set a default rate at company level. And we have rates 5 to 99, which can be used as company rates, which apply across the board. So they can't be amended per individual employee. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up a few of these just to show you how they work. So just bringing these slides down. I'm going to return to my payment settings, so company payroll and then payments. I'm going to select remote work because this one I am going to use a rate-based payment. So if I click edit, I can tick the box down here to say that this one is based on an hourly rate. And for this one, I'm going to use company rate 5 because it's going to be the same rate for anyone with this payment. So I can go ahead and save that payment setting. And let's create a brand new one using my other example of mileage. So we set it as an expenses payment because it is going to be reported under ERR. I'm going to make it an hourly payment by ticking the box to say it's based on an hourly rate. But this time I'm going to choose rate 2, which can be entered in the employee records. And with this being a mileage payment, that would fall under the travel unvouched category. So I'll be repaying this based on the rates civil service rates or lower published by revenue. So I made a few changes to this new payment. I'm going to click on to save. So we can see the rate that's being used for each of these rate-based payments. And if I close out of this screen, I just want to show you where you enter the hourly rates, if you don't already know. So for company rates, you go to company payroll and you click down on the hourly rates option. So I'll be using rate 5 for remote working daily allowance, €3.20. And for the mileage payments, I've decided to use rate 2. So to enter the rate for an individual employee, go into their details and click the payments tab. And in this case, it is rate 2. I'm going to pay this at 40 cents per kilometre. So with that now set up, we're going to do some processing so we can show you the effect of these changes. So I've already set period 8 and I'm going to jump into enter time and pay. Let's assume I've already retrieved the latest RPNs. So when we go into the timesheets, what I can see straight away is that for the remote work payment, it has pulled through that company rate of €3.20. And for the mileage payments, it's pulled through rate 2 from that specific employee record. So let's pop some values in. So this first employee has €50 of general travel and subsistence. And I'm also paying them 100 kilometers of mileage at 40 cents per kilometer. So you can see with these rate-based payments, I'm putting in the unit, the 100 times 40 cents, which is €40. For the ones that are not rates-based, I would just put the total amount here in this box. On to my next employee. This employee is a remote worker. So I want to pay them for 5 days at the remote working allowance. So I've just put the 5 in. It's multiplied by the rate, giving us the €16. Third employee, I've got some general travel and subsistence. And I'm also going to put some mileage in for them. Now notice that there's no rate for this particular employee, and that's because I haven't entered a rate for rate 2 in their employee record, and there isn't one entered at company level. So for this one, I can actually type a rate in, but if I wanted that to be saved and always used, I could fill in rate 2 in the employee. And then we'll just do one more. So I'm going to do a small benefit exemption item. So if you've processed these before, you'll know that they're non-cash payments. So in order to record the value of the small benefit, but not include it in the net pay, we enter the amount of the gift, the gift card or whatever the small benefit is. And then I also have a net deduction to take away that same amount. So with this one, I've got my small benefit, I've got my deduction, and this is the one that we've linked to a category. It's one of the ones that we've linked to a category. So I'm just going to save the standard taxable payments for everyone else. And then you would complete your payroll in the usual way. So run off the usual reports. You'd run end of period. And then you would send your payroll submission to report your taxable payments and deductions. So that process hasn't changed. That would be sent through in the usual way. So that's my pay run complete. I'm now at end of period. Just to recap some of the changes we've just shown you, we've got the payment categories linked to the payments now. So you'll see in the next demo that they are automatically categorized in the submission. And we also had a couple of rate-based payments that can either be linked to employee hourly rates, rate 1 to 4, or company rates 5 to 99. So next up, we're going to look at the submission process, and we're going to see how some of the earlier improvements feed through to this process. So we have enhanced categorizing the expenses, now giving you more flexible options. So there are now 3 ways to categorize. It can either be done automatically based on the expense payment category you've assigned. It can still be done manually for anything still flagged as a general enhanced reporting expense. Or you can import categorized expenses from a CSV file. You can do that if you have Sage Payroll Professional. And I'll show you an example of importing later on in the webinar. So let's just rejoin the demo and go into the submission itself. So a couple of other enhancements I want to show you. So first of all, we have put some reminder messages in case you forget to do an enhanced report in submission. So if I'm in a rush and I go to set the next period, if I click on next on set period, you can see that I'm getting a warning that we've detected expense payments have been processed, but an enhanced reporting submission has not been made for the current period. So that is reminding me to complete that submission to ROS. So I can click yes to do the submission now. That would take me into the submission screen. So it saves us having to sort of restore back or resend the submission, which is something that you can now do. But as I've cancelled out and I'm still in period 8, I'm just going to go into the submission from the pay run. And what you can see for this period is that I do have some amounts that are already categorized. So I have 250 euros of small benefit because I used the small benefit payment, which I'd linked to that type of expense. I have some travel unvouched. So these actually relate to the mileage payments, again, which are linked to the travel unvouched category. And scrolling to the right, I've got the remote working amount paid. So it's pulled through the total value, but in the current update, it doesn't pull through the units that were entered. So you will still need to manually enter the number of days of remote working that relates to. So in this case, it is 5, but in a future update, it will be able to pull that through from the time and pay screen as well. So that's some auto-categorized information, but we still have some balances that are currently excluded from enhanced reporting. And these relate to the values that I entered against my general travel and subsistence payment. So for this one, I'm going to do what I always have done and categorize manually. So I've got some subsistence vouched for the first employee. This one's fully categorized. I've got 75, which is actually split between travel vouched and subsistence vouched in this case. And everything else is allocated. As we can see, there's nothing excluded from enhanced reporting. And these values now match up with the total expenses processed in time and pay. So more flexibility there in the categorization, hopefully some time savers for you as well. When we continue on with the submission, you'll see you've got your certificate details and you would click onto next. It'll do its usual validation checks and it'll still alert you to any errors or warnings that you need to address. And on screen, it'll give you the summary, the totals of each category you're about to submit. But it is now possible to export a detailed report so that you can check the individual employee submission values by simply clicking Export Details at the bottom of the screen here. And that will then generate the report that you can check. So 5 pages in total. You can see there's a page for each individual employee, showing me the categorized amounts. And you could save or print this from here. And it will also be available in your submission log once you've made the submission. So a handy way to check what you're about to submit before you send it. I'm happy with the values though, so I'm going to go ahead and click Submit. That is then sent to Revenue. And then we've got the submission ID and status shown on screen. That same report that you can export earlier can now be found in the submission log. So that is the submission process in version 27.1. Some subtle changes there, but just to recap, it is now possible to automatically categorize based on the payments entered in time and pay. Can still do it manually though. So if you've got any general enhanced reporting expenses, you would type in the relevant amounts into the columns, and you can still import categorized expenses from the import file. The submission report was available on the summary screen, the review details screen. So that can be run before sending now. And some improved messaging. So you saw the first one. If you try to set the next period without having sent your ERR submission, You'll be prompted to complete that now. And another slight enhancement, if you haven't entered any expense payments for that period, or you haven't imported any expense payments, if you try to do a submission, you will see the message below just explaining why there are no employees to include in the submission. So if no payments with expense type have been processed, the assumption there is you don't need to do an ERR submission. If you import your ERR expenses, it will show the details of the employees you've imported in this grid. Okay, so moving on to the last section of the webinar, and we'd like to show you some improvements that we've made to corrections for ERR submissions. So in the previous version, 27.0, you could resend an ERR submission for the period you are currently in. But if you need to send anything for a previous period, you would either have to restore a backup or restore a period archive, or perhaps consider doing it manually on the ROS portal. But we've now made an improvement where it is possible to send a correction or a submission for a previous period whilst being in a later period in your program. So types of scenarios where you would need to do this would be if you've forgotten to do an ERR submission. So maybe you didn't see that warning didn't exist actually in previous versions. So you moved into the next period and you remember, I needed to send that. So you can do that without having to restore back. And also if you've used the wrong categories in a previous submission, makes it really easy to go back into that period for the submission itself, correct the categorization, and then resend it. So I'm going to show you a couple of corrections. And the second one I do, I'm going to import some employees as well. So let's bring the slides down and return to our demo. So it's come to light for me that in period 5, I did an ERR submission, but I'd used the wrong categories. So I'm going to show you how to resend that and amend the categories in that submission. So I'll start by going to Direct Payroll Reporting at the top of the screen. Come down to Enhanced Reporting, and then I can choose this third option, Resend Enhanced Reporting Submission. So this screen shows you all previous periods that have been processed. In my case, it was period 5, 2nd of February, where I made a mistake. So I can select that. I can then click Continue, and that will then take me into the submission grid for that particular period. So at the time, I put it all through with subsistence unvouched. So it was €100 for these 3 employees. But I've realized that I should have used other categories. So for this first one, I'm just going to set the subsistence to 0, as that was actually travel unvouched. For the second one, it was a mixture. As you can see, I'm just moving the numbers around, and we'll make a change to this one as well. And you can see that that has now changed the categorized values. So if I'm happy with how it's categorized now, I can save this, move on to the next step. It is then going to show me the new submission totals based on those changes that I've just made. So the totals of this corrected submission, where it's now using the categories that I've just used. We can still export the report if we want to double check it before we resend it. But I'm happy with it. I'm just going to click Submit, and it will then send that correction to revenue. So if it's just a problem with categorization, really simple to go in and resend. And the same if you just missed the submission, you can resend for a previous period without having to restore back. So that's example number 1. For my second example, I'm hoping to hopefully pick up on a common question around corrections, which is it possible to send an enhanced reporting submission for a previous period if expense payments weren't processed for that period in Sage Payroll? So usually there needs to be an expense payment for the employee to appear in the submission itself. So the answer is yes, it is possible. So there's two ways of doing it. The first way is how it was in the previous version. You can restore a backup to that earlier period, reprocess the time and pay screen with expenses payments entered, and then when you run end of period again, you can send your enhanced report in submission, and then you'll be able to send the details for anyone that you've corrected the payments for. Now, the second option, because with that one, you would then have to reprocess your payroll up to date. If you have Sage Payroll Professional, is you can import ERR values for a previous period and use the resend enhanced reported submission option to send the corrected submission. And with that way, you wouldn't have to go back to an earlier period. You can import the values for the earlier period and you can send a submission by selecting that period from the resend screen. Now, the alternative in both these cases is to manually submit the expenses for the previous period. You can do that via the ROS portal. So let's take a look at this one. So for this correction, it was actually back in period 1 where I had some employees that received a small benefit item under the small benefit exemption. It wasn't reported at the time and we didn't put through an expense payment for it in period 1. Now, because I have Payroll Professional, it means I can import categorized ERR values. So just as a reminder, we do have an import guide. This is article just here, which contains the files that you'll need to import. So there's two files, there's an import file and a CSV file where you enter the actual data that you want to import. And we've got some guidance on how to create that CSV file and exactly what you need to put in each column. So I'm not going to read through this, but I'm going to show you a file that I created for period 1. So in the first column, I've put the employee code and I've formatted this as a text column so that it keeps the leading zeros. Second column, I've put the period number. So this is for period 1. Third column is the type of pay run. It was a normal pay run, so N for normal. And then columns D through to N are where you can categorize expenses. The guide tells you exactly what goes in each column, but small benefit happens to be column D. So I've got €500 of small benefit that I'm going to import for 3 of my employees for period 1. So a very simple CSV file that I've set up. I'm still in period 8, so I haven't restored back or anything. I'm going to go to miscellaneous and data import. Go to the data import option. And then I'm just going to browse to my import categorize expenses file and click open. And that will then read the data from the CSV file that I've just shown you. And if I go to direct payroll reporting, enhanced reporting, and then resend enhanced reporting submission, I can now go back to period 1. I can select that from the list and click continue. And that then takes me into the submission screen. Now, originally, I had 3 employees where I did process expenses payments, and they have been correctly categorized. So I'm not making any changes to these first 3 employees. But I did have 3 missing employees. So these are the ones where I've imported €500 each of small benefit. So you can see it's been categorized in this grid. But because there was no expenses payment originally processed on time and pay, it does just show that the expenses related to enhanced reporting is the €500, and it just shows the negative that amount as an amount excluded from enhanced reporting. So it's just a quirk of importing when there are no expenses on the time and pay screen. But the important bit is the expense categories, and this is what will be sent over to revenue. So if I'm happy with that categorization, I would click on to save and next. I would continue on with this submission. So again, it's going to show me corrected totals for period 1 this time. So small benefit has gone up to the €2,000 in total, including the extra ones that I've just imported. I can then go ahead and submit, and that will then send the correction for period 1 directly to revenue. So that will also update the submission log. which you can view from direct payroll reporting, enhanced reporting, view enhanced reporting submission log. We can see the latest date of submission where we can export that report if we want to see what that corrected submission looked like. So that is just some changes to the corrections option, and also a slight enhancement to importing. So previously when you imported, it wouldn't have shown employees that didn't have expenses payments on the time and pay screen. But in 27.1, if you do an import, it will show the details of anyone that was in the CSV file, assuming that they did have a timesheet saved at the time. So it didn't need to have expenses on it, but they did need to have been paid in the pay run. So hopefully that answers that particular question, and it does bring us to the end of what we're going to show you here in the webinar. So we are going to stick around just to give you the opportunity to ask any of your questions, and the team behind the scenes will be answering those. If you want to keep any of the answers to the questions, you will need to copy and paste them into another document, and you can grab a copy of the slides as well if you'd like to keep the handout. Now, if you think of a question after the webinar, I've put together some useful links. So we do have an ERR hub on our help center. So a direct link to that hub is available here. Or if you access the help center in product, you'll find it as one of the main options that you can click on. We have a Sage Advice blog, which outlines the legislation around enhanced reporting requirements. And we also have a link there to Revenue's ERR hub with further detail on exactly what you need to report. You can also find much of this information in our help center at sage.ie/help. So you can see there is a link to the enhanced reporting requirements hub, and you'll be able to search for keywords. So v27.1 to find the installer, or ERR import if you're looking for that import guide. It's all there available for you in our help center, as well as contact details for the support team should you need the extra help with that. So with that said, we're going to close things down there. So thanks ever so much for joining us today. Enjoy the rest of your week. Have a great weekend. And maybe we'll see you in the future on another one of our Sage Payroll webinars. So goodbye for now.